Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining AIDA for this webinar to mark the United Nations International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. If you don't know me, my name is Margaret Morton. I am the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, or AIDA as we know it, and I am delighted to be your host today. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining us from today, and I acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in today's event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connection to the lands, the waters and the skies across Australia. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the referendum that is happening this Saturday across Australia. I extend my support to First Nations Australians across the country as we go through this process, and I recognise that for many this process has been very challenging. Certainly the consideration of a voice to Parliament is a relevant one within the context of today's webinar. I ask that all comments that occur in the chat and all questions that are going to be asked are done so in the spirit of respect and mutual care and concern. Which brings me to some housekeeping notes. Today's event, as are all of our events, will be recorded and the event will be made available to you all afterwards. I do encourage you to use the chat. I can see that many of you are doing so, to say hello, introduce yourself, acknowledge the country and the land on which you are standing as you join us today, and share any thoughts or reflections with one another about the content of today's webinar. We will be using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to take questions. So please feel free to pop those questions in at any time throughout the webinar, and feel free to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button. I'll go through those questions at the end of the seminar and we'll do our very best to answer as many of them as we can. Again, I would like to reinforce my request that we all remain respectful toward one another and to the panelists in posting comments and questions in the Q&A. The chat window is provided, and we do this quite intentionally as a shared space for participants to engage in a respectful way with one another while learning, and we aim to continue to offer this as a way of being inclusive to all. So a few comments about today's webinar in terms of its content. Every year on October the 13th, the United Nations General Assembly observes the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And they do so with the aim of fostering a global culture focused on reducing the risks and the impacts of disasters. This year's theme is fighting inequality for a resilient future. According to the United Nations, current climate projections indicate that by 2030, which is only 7 years away, the world will witness more than 500 disasters annually. It's important for us to acknowledge that disasters disproportionately affect impoverished and marginalised groups in our society. These individuals and groups are often located in regions of high risk, prone to hazards, and they reside in substandard housing. It's affordable housing and often therefore lacks some of the things that need to occur in a house or a building to make it resilient. And these groups and individuals also lack access to necessary resources to effectively withstand and then recover when an event occurs to them. The consequences of all of these events often exacerbates existing disparity and pushes some groups deeper and deeper into poverty. We can mitigate the detrimental effects of hazards on the marginalised members of society by actively involving these individuals and groups in developing disaster risk reduction plans at any level of the system, from the individual, household, neighbourhood or community, region or state, and even nationally. These communities not only hold the most pertinent insights regarding their own specific needs for enhancing their resilience and the resilience of others in their community, but they also have knowledge that can work for the benefit of all of us. We simply need to include their voices and listen. So today I'm really pleased to present to you a panel of individuals from quite a broad spectrum of knowledge and life experience. And each panellist will discuss an issue that as it stands in Australia today, and as well we'll explore some ways in which we can ensure a more resilient future for us all. So one by one, I'll introduce our speakers. It's my absolute pleasure to do so. Bhiamie Williamson is a research fellow at Monash University and the National Indigenous Disaster Resilience Project Lead with Flourish. Hi, Bhiamie. Joanna Quilty is the Chief Executive Officer at the New South Wales Council of Social Service. Hello, Joanna. Loriana Bethune is the Research Development Manager with Gender and Disaster Australia, or GADAUS. Hello, Loriana. Excellent. And Dr. Bronwyn Lay is the Strategic Lead for the Climate Justice Support Unit at the Federation of Community Legal Centres. Hello, Bronwyn. So those of you who regularly come to our webinars will know the drill. I'll basically ask a question of each of the panellists. We've got some more questions up our sleeve. We'll see how our time goes. And I do encourage you to use the Q&A and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. So Bhiamie, to you first. Through your research, you've demonstrated a multitude of ways that First Nations people are disproportionately affected by disaster. What does this really mean in the context of the here and now, and what does it mean for us going forward?
Thank you, Margaret. It's lovely to be with everyone, and yeah, really thrilled to have been invited to contribute to this panel. So a lot of people are acknowledging country, which is fantastic. I'm joining from my Ngurumba, my home country, my home camp out here in Garuga in northwest New South Wales, where I consider myself very lucky to have the opportunity to live and work at home in my home community and on my grandmother's country out here. And just before jumping into the question, Margaret, just reflecting on your opening statements around the referendum coming this weekend, that is casting a large cloud over basically everything that's going on at the moment, in particular this discussion. When people come to me and ask me for direction or, about the voice generally, what I generally encourage people to do is, if you haven't already, make sure, please, you read the Uluru Statement from the heart. That's where this comes from. Secondly, if you're unsure, you just Google what is the voice and look at a couple of authoritative resources. And finally, read the question and make up your own mind. So it's three simple, practical things that I think everyone, really should be doing as an engaged, responsible citizen, and take seriously this responsibility to make an informed choice around something as important as the Constitution. But yeah, please read the Uluru Statement, read some resources about what is the voice, and read the question. So starting there and jumping into your question, Margaret, look, some of the ways that the research that I've led over a few years now has highlighted, the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples. We use the strategic language around disproportionately impacting Indigenous peoples to highlight a few structural issues that occur consistently across various disasters and across various years and locations around Australia. First of all is the higher rates of Indigenous populations, that is just the sheer number of people proportional to the population. Indigenous populations are much higher proportionally in areas, local government areas affected by disasters. We showed this in the 2019-20 bushfires that occurred up and down the East Coast, focusing particularly on New South Wales and Victoria and the ACT. And we also demonstrated this with the 2022 South East Queensland and Northern Rivers floods. In those two instances, Indigenous peoples were more than double the proportion of the population impacted. There are also socioeconomic factors compounding, more people, things like prevalence of overcrowded dwellings. Generally, there's more people. Where there's an Indigenous household, there's more people than the average, in the mainstream, on average. Much higher prevalence of babies and infants and children, school-aged children. So in 2019-20, the bushfires, we demonstrated that of all the children impacted by those bushfires in those jurisdictions, 1 in 10 of them was Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Also, the prevalence of discrete communities, that is, discrete Aboriginal communities living on Aboriginal land, generally living in Aboriginal housing, that kind of exist outside of local government structures. It means that local government services are not provided in the same way that they're provided in local towns or regional centres and the like. And generally, they're kind of separate from the arrangements, the existing arrangements managing disasters in Australia. And also the prevalence of cultural and heritage rights, native title, land rights, these kinds of things, registered Aboriginal parties in Victoria, Aboriginal places in Queensland and the like. So all of these things mean that Indigenous peoples are more likely to be impacted. They're impacted in unique ways, and Indigenous peoples have important legal responsibilities for their culture and heritage, which are not accounted for in disaster arrangements. So when we talk about disproportionately and uniquely impacted, they're some of the things that we mean. One of the other really significant findings from our research is, quite frankly, the almost complete lack of incorporation into of Indigenous peoples and some of these unique factors into the national and state and territory emergency management and disaster resilience policies, and by extension, the arrangements that come from those policies. So what does this mean? It means that, quite bluntly, a system of disadvantage already exists, and that system of disadvantage specifically disadvantages Indigenous peoples in ways that are unique to that group. So they're being impacted more and in unique ways, and the policies, knowledge and practice of emergencies and disasters, managing emergencies and disasters, is, quite frankly, not designed to meet our community's needs. For instance, a couple of examples of what this looks like in practice: disaster relief payments, which are provided when a national disaster is declared. Those disaster payments are usually calculated according to median households, but as I said before, Indigenous household structures are very different to non-Indigenous household structures. So you've got a system of, say, $1,000 relief payment per adult. A household with 3 adults will get more than a household with 1 adult and 4 kids. The Indigenous population is more likely to be. Insurance: Indigenous people are chronically underinsured or not insured at all, and insurance and Aboriginal housing are very interesting kind of mixes there, and that extends into things like buybacks. So they have a less of an ability to sell their house and relocate, mitigate, meaning they've got less ability to adapt and make choices and don't have the same level of mobility as non-Indigenous groups. Grants and fundings: generally a lot of disaster relief and resilience grants are funded through local government areas, but as I said, local governments generally don't account for discrete Aboriginal communities, and so we've got a proportion and specific kind of communities that are frankly excluded from a lot of the grant opportunities in disaster resilience in this country. And also cultural heritage: Indigenous peoples, when they have things like native title recognised, they've actually got legal responsibilities to protect, maintain, and maintain their cultural heritage on behalf of their people. And yet the emergency management laws in this country do not account for cultural heritage beyond having a mapper in a large IMT that may identify where cultural heritage exists, and that may be incorporated into an emergency response. So we see, at a time when Indigenous people's disasters are at greatest threat, they're most disempowered in protecting that cultural heritage. Look, I know that I'm probably taking more time than I then I'm allowed, Margaret, and I apologise for that. But look, there's what this means basically is that if you are interested, if you're in emergency services or disaster resilience and you're interested in working with and supporting Indigenous communities, you're going to be doing it out on a limb. There are very few supporting mechanisms. There are very few resources. So if you feel like you're out on a limb and doing this stuff by yourself, it's because you are. And everyone working in this space in Indigenous communities is in that position. And so we're trying to change that context to make sure there's sufficient policy instruments to support people in their work, to ensure there's sufficient granting opportunities, to ensure that there are sufficient legal arrangements and Indigenous leadership is being strategically inserted into the disaster arrangements in this country. For instance, Victoria's developed a wonderful Aboriginal culture and healing strategy in ERV. Really encourage you all to have a look at that. And the South Australian government have recently designated an Aboriginal stream in their disaster resilience granting. So we're seeing the emergence of the change of practice, but what we need to see is these kind of droplets of change turn into a full-on river that can really create some lasting opportunities. Yeah, so I'll leave it there, Margaret, and really look forward to the future conversation.
Thank you so much, Bhiamie, and I think what you've demonstrated in that very succinct list of very specific examples is that we could just talk to you for the next hour or longer and just ignore everybody else. But we won't do that. I thank you for joining us, and I thank you for your research and your leadership on all of these issues. We'll come back to what to do about the very depressing outline that you've just given. But for now, let's move on to Loriana, and we'll come back to you, Bhiamie, over time. So Gender and Disaster Australia, for anyone who's online and if you have not come across the GADOS crew, I encourage you to follow the links the team will be putting in the chat and Google to your heart's content about the work of Gender and Disaster Australia. They've conducted extensive research on the connection between gender and risk during disasters. Loriana, I wonder if you could tell us about the risks associated with gender before, during and after a disaster or an emergency.
Absolutely. Thanks, Margaret. But before, I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which I speak to you today, the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I think it's really important to recognise that these lands have always been lands of teaching and learning, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. Yeah, thanks so much. Gender and Disaster Australia have really spent a lot of resources and research highlighting the connection between gender and disaster risks as a complex and critical problem that we need to understand in the phases before, during, and after disasters. So what do I mean by that? So before disasters, what we see is this real imperative to consider the gender differences right from the preparedness phase. In our research, we've spoken to women about disaster planning and when they're putting together fire plans and flood plans and trying to understand what's happening with a gendered lens. And what we're really seeing is this kind of idea of the notion of the man as the head of the household and the women's lack of autonomy in participating in that planning, most likely due to their other commitments, such as caregiving or taking care of the house. So that even at this level, women are kind of existing in unequal, right? So, and as I will explain to you a little bit later, they will also bear the brunt of disaster in terms of the recovery process as well. So in our research, what we found that the social construction of gender and gender roles and preparedness results in more men than women learning those disaster skills as well. So they're more likely to know how to use a chainsaw or how to use a generator to facilitate firefighting or clearing the roads and trees to escape, even though they're probably less likely to be present with their family over women as well. When we've looked at our research, we've worked with women and LGBTQIA+ individuals as well. And what we've really noticed is that they're often marginalised in their access to resources and the decision-making power, and they face hurdles in effectively preparing for disasters. So for instance, we're looking at, say, a gender pay gap, which also exists with LGBTQIA+ individuals as well, which may lead to reduced financial resources and affecting their ability to secure essentials like shelter and transportation and supplies in the lead up to a disaster. So during a disaster, what we will also see is a reversion to traditional gender roles, even more so than prior. So that once a disaster strikes, the unequal impact across genders can really become evident. Disasters tend to kind of exacerbate existing gender inequalities that result in in distinct consequences for women, men, and LGBTQIA+ individuals. So women, who are often the primary caregivers in their families, they face unique challenges. They must care for children, the elderly, or individuals with disabilities during a crisis, which can really limit their mobility and their ability to be able to access safe spaces. Pets are also another responsibility that often falls to women at the last minute, and this can be really challenging during a difficult time. Men, on the other hand, are really expected to protect their house and property, and if they're a volunteer firefighter or SES worker, they're also expected to protect their community at the cost of their family. And in catastrophic events, this is an impossible expectation as well. So this also leads to women and children being left to drive out of bushfire or flood-affected areas alone, frequently in life-threatening circumstances. So in our research, what we've spoken to many women who've spoken about having to leave themselves with their children whilst their partner stays behind. And this is often in a confusing last-minute conversation that's happened, which more often than not contravenes their kind of previous plans that they may have made. In the research that we've conducted specifically with LGBTQIA communities, what we've really found is that isolation is a key issue for these communities and these individuals during a disaster, whether it's COVID, a fire, or a flood. What they're talking about is their lack of access to their social community. They may be in a geographic community, and they may be within that, but their lack of access to their social community can really be debilitating for them and has a substantial impact on their mental health. And then when it comes to after disasters, this can have its flow-on effect as well in terms of highlighting like the disrespect and discrimination they may face during a response and recovery. So an example of this is when people of this community, they may be forced to disclose their sexual orientation due to homelessness or damage to their homes, and this can lead to kind of further vulnerabilities. Access to denied and safe services can be denied in certain recovery and relief centres, with the idea that response agencies are thinking, look, this is not a cruise ship, we need to be able to provide something for everybody. But for LGBTQI community members, like this is not a luxury for them, these are requirements for them as people. So just returning to women after disasters, this kind of caregiving burden that women are laboured with, it's coupled with job losses and increased work hours. It places significant stress on women. And post-disaster, what we found is there's a real increase in voluntary work undertaken by women, which can also lead to burnout. But to kind of add salt to that wound, is there's a lack of recognition for the leadership roles that women play during recovery by government. And in the past, it's really been focused on the response phase, the heroes, the men of the response. This lack of recognition can really compound challenges for women following in recovery phase. Transportation and access to services, especially in rural and remote areas, present significant hurdles for women and LGBTQI communities. Health services, birthing facilities, reproductive health support, counselling, they can all completely remain out of reach for those in lower socioeconomic circumstances, which are more often than not women and LGBTQIA+ individuals. But in terms of mental health, it's men in particular that may visibly suffer. So what we've found in our research has really uncovered is that if men fail to perform masculinity in a disaster, they can feel a real crisis of identity. They may be asked continually what they did in the disaster, and then they'll be judged for their action or inaction. And I think that can really affect their mental health. And it's an example that we've got is I think we had some men talking about how they chose to drive their family to safety rather than be on the back of a truck, and they were judged by the community and ended up having to leave the community in the recovery phase because of that. So balancing increased their housing responsibilities in post-disaster, and then balancing that with their work or reduced work, that can be really overwhelming for men. And what's really important to note is they will tend to seek formal psychological help far less frequently than women. And we suggest that this is absolutely not accidental, that this is a result of the stringent gendered expectations of men to be strong and silent and stoic. And there are real penalties for men in both terms of their career and their status in their family and their community if they step outside these boundaries. So, but with these expectations, there's also male privilege. So whereas women, as opposed to men, they're expected to forgo their autonomy and their career and their and even their safety, family violence, post-disaster, in order to support their male partner and also their children. So they need to put their family, themselves last in order for their family and also their community. So what we talk about is that after disaster, it can also lead to trauma, which is also associated with relationship breakdown, affecting men and women differently. This can cause increased violence in the home and self-harm amongst men as well, and that creates really complex consequences. So we've spoken at length about this in a previous webinar, and if you're interested, I really suggest you have a look. I think someone from AIDA will put the link in the chat. Deb and Steve talk really passionately about this, and it's really worth watching and get yourself informed about this, because I think you might think that this doesn't touch you in some way, but if you work in this sector, I very much suggest you would, and maybe in an unknown way that you hadn't thought of previously. And so we just ask you to think a little bit harder on that. So I'm going to sum up. Sorry, I've spoken for quite a while. Disasters don't impact everyone equally, and different genders have different needs. Recognising that gender-related issues is pivotal to crafting effective disaster management strategies is really important. Gender-sensitive policies and practices aren't just a matter of equity, but they're essential for building more resilient and more inclusive communities that can better withstand disasters. Thanks.
Thank you, Loriana. And again, you've demonstrated that actually there's a great deal to understand and unpack about the impacts on different genders and different groups of these events. So we'll leave it there for the moment on gender. I would like to progress to Joanna. Hang with us, Bronwyn. We are going to get to you. Joanna, I'm curious. You've commissioned at the NCOS, or the New South Wales Council of Social Services, research referred to as the Aftershock series that quantifies the economic and social costs of disasters and their disproportionate impact, as our two previous speakers have unpacked, on more vulnerable population groups. I wondered if you could just share with us some of the key insights and recommendations from that research.
Certainly, Margaret, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this really important event today. I'm on Gadigal land. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal colleagues joining us here today. We commenced that research, the Aftershock series, at the beginning of 2022, when New South Wales had gone through a really tumultuous 2.5 or so years, starting with bushfires at the end of 2019, interspersed with various COVID lockdowns and also flooding experiences. And at the time, the prevailing narrative was very much focused on economic recovery, how quickly the economy was rebounding, which industries were coming back sooner rather than later. And that really wasn't aligning with what we were hearing from our member organisations on the ground. There did seem to be a big disconnect. What our members on the ground were telling us about was the very human struggles that communities were facing, that many were still not coming back or having the opportunity to recover to the extent that is necessary, and that there were very uneven impacts because of these events. So we commissioned the research because we really wanted to shift that narrative. We wanted to move from that economic discourse to focus on the very human impacts of disaster and of the last 2.5 years of the experience in New South Wales. And we collaborated with a bunch of other peak bodies, including ABSEC, which is the Child and Family Aboriginal peak body in New South Wales. We had New South Wales Community Legal Centres in the mix, People with Disabilities Australia, DV New South Wales. A whole range of us came together to commission this research to, as I said, explore the impacts of disasters and the pandemic on vulnerable groups in particular, but on communities across New South Wales, and also to model the economic impacts of those very human impacts, because we did want to get across to government a sense of urgency that we all end up paying for this if we don't take action now. So we really wanted to put it fairly and squarely on the agenda. We came together, we jointly commissioned the work, we engaged Impact Economics. They drew on available literature and the best available data, recognising that, you know, it's always an imperfect science. The data is always continuing to become available. So the exercise we undertook over the course of 2022 was most likely underestimating impacts and also costs. The domains of wellbeing that we particularly focused on were mental health, domestic violence, housing security, and child wellbeing and development. And the findings were pretty stark. So when it comes to mental health, drawing on that best available data at the time, what we found was that over the course of 12 months to 2 to 3 years, there was a 46% increase in young women, young girls, 12 to 17, presenting with suicidal thoughts or self-harming behaviour. There was a 21% increase in people reporting an increase in depression and anxiety. We modelled the costs of this. And what that showed was that because of increase or decreases in productivity and increased need for services and support, the cost to the New South Wales economy was $7.4 billion over a 5-year period if we just continued on a business as usual path. When it came to domestic violence, what the available evidence told us was that over 2020, because that was when the best data was available, 60,000 people experienced, an additional 60,000 people, women in the main, experienced domestic violence for the first time, and 46,000 experienced a worsening of domestic violence. Obviously, a lot of that was to do with the pandemic and the lockdowns. So clearly understating the extent of the problem, because not taking into account the fact that we know domestic violence increases in the face of natural disasters. And the costs associated with just that pandemic effect in that 1 year of 2020 were really significant. $3.3 billion in direct costs to do with lost productivity and an increased need for services, but something like $24.5 billion when you factor in pain and suffering and premature mortality. So some really big impacts there. In terms of housing security, our data and our modelling indicated that 54,000 households entered into or experienced a worsening of housing stress, over a 12-month period. And in regional New South Wales, there was a 52% increase in people experiencing extreme housing stress, which is where you're paying more than 50% of your income in housing costs, and that there was an increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness. And again, significant costs associated with that, up to $2.5 billion. And then when we came to child wellbeing and development, we found that there was an increase in the number of kids in lower socioeconomic areas starting school developmentally vulnerable. There was an increase in reports of significant harm being made to the Departments of Community and Justice. And there was a drop-off in learning and educational attainment for kids in lower socioeconomic areas. And that modelled over the course of a lifetime, and factoring in that there would be lost employment opportunities, lost earning opportunities, equated to $16.5 billion for those kids in those lower socioeconomic areas. So really significant economic costs that we all bear if we don't put in place additional resources, supports and investment, particularly focused on disadvantaged communities and vulnerable population groups, to ensure that they are able to recover at the same rate and pace as the rest of the community, if we want to avoid that widening of disparity that we know happens so readily after a disaster. And yes, so there's a series of 4 reports available on our website, some really straightforward, clear recommendations that we know would make a difference that we've put to government. We've got to play the long game. You know, we get some wins, but often it's short-term funding that disappears after a couple of years. So, you know, that research is really useful because the data is so stark, those numbers are so hard-hitting, and we continue to push those messages at every opportunity.
Thank you, Joanna. And as the audience is commenting in the chat, we have some exceptional speakers here today, and there's a wealth of information that you will all have access to afterwards. And it's extremely hard to contain any one of you because there's so much to learn, and there's such an imperative to change the situation that each of you is describing. Before we go to a broader question, though, I would like to invite Bronwyn to say hello. And, you know, we don't normally in AIDA include kind of a legal perspective. This is a bit of a new thing for us. But a number of the issues that the previous speakers have raised have me thinking, well, and there are legal consequences here. So I'm interested. Many of us don't think about law or legal issues, and particularly people affected by crises don't tend to think about the legal issues they will face until they're facing them after an event. So why is disaster justice important, and how are the issues in accessing justice impacting people and community legal centres that people that the community legal centres work with? Give us a bit of an intro to this from your perspective.
Thanks, Margaret. And also cut me off if I'm going on too far, because I'm also really interested in getting into the panel discussion collectively. But before answering the question, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Wurundjeri country, where I'm speaking to you from today, acknowledge elders past and present, and that First Nations sovereignty was never ceded. And in saying that, Bhiamie mentioned it before, also noting that First Nations law still is with us. And also, as we go into understanding community legal centres and the law, that the work that First Nations legal services do across many countries in Australia is incredible. So disaster justice. So disaster justice focuses on the role of governing structures, i.e. laws and regulations, in creating and perpetuating risks, inequalities and injustices that get magnified in natural hazards. So, and also I think you mentioned it, and I've felt it here in the room here, whether we like it or not and whether we feel it or not, we all live in a really law-thick world. So law is ubiquitous and a pivotal determinant of equality. So like everyday life, we often forget that law also determines everything in disasters. It determines risks and vulnerabilities, policies, the pathways we can take, the outcomes, and importantly here today, I wanted to stress, it does determine effective and equitable recovery. And it goes back to that common misunderstanding that I think a lot of us have, that I spend a lot of time pushing against, might have a truth to it, that law is there just to make fights, or we're just ambulance chasers, or we're just here to set up a royal commission after the fact. But community legal centres and the legal assistance sector with legal aid, we exist to empower and enable people to get back on their feet quicker. And communities really need help navigating this complex legal beast. So, for example, and we have many, the issues of disaster are rising a lot for the legal assistance sector, and some of the laws that govern the livelihoods of impacted communities are what you would know well. There's insurance, tenancy, family violence has been mentioned, also family law issues, employment, occupational health and safety. Law also determines emergency management procedures, stay or go rights, discrimination at recovery, hubs, cultural heritage, the right to disaster payments. It determines all our civil, social and economic rights. And as we know, people and communities can be decimated overnight due to a hazard, and the pathway towards recovery, it does meet so many different legal issues. And so justice and equality in ordinary times relies on access to good legal advice so that these issues can be resolved as early as possible. And so this is the same, if not more important, in disasters. So what are we seeing in the legal assistance sector in relation to as disasters rise in frequency in the areas that we work? We're seeing the same legal issues we've always been seeing, but they're exacerbated and there's more of them. So services get more stretched. Community service organisations, most of you would know that services get stretched during disasters, but areas such as consumer and family law issues take on a whole different dimension as a result of a disaster. Importantly, for recovery issues, we have clients who don't seek legal help early in navigating their insurance, their tenancy, building issues, and there's quite a few that have been forced into homelessness, and then there's the issue of living illegally in tents or in caravans, having to dodge local councils and other regulatory bodies. And then we've got issues of pod villages. What are the tenancy arrangements or the lessee arrangements there? And then there's compounding impacts that follow, and they all have legal consequences like family violence, poverty, unemployment, substance abuse, and mental health issues. So legal needs not only change due to disasters, but they so easily snowball. So missing a debt repayment, piling up infringement notices because you're too stressed to, or you just don't get them through and your communication's down, unable to meet court dates because you're unsure whether the court is open due to evacuation orders in the region, and then being penalised because you're already in this spiral of trauma and trying to catch up for not responding in time or not knowing how to do the correct application to get leeway or get exemptions from that. So early advice about rights and ways to navigate these really complex regulatory and legal systems, and we know that from the whole issue of robo-debt and the outcomes of that, these are really complex systems. Getting early advice about that could have prevented many of these livelihood and stress issues up front and often stopped them from snowballing and occurring. So an important learning we have had is that people in areas impacted by disasters often don't realise their problem has a legal solution, or even that they have a legal problem. And so this is now backed up by recent research released from the Victorian Law Foundation. They did a public understanding of law survey, where it was found those with legal issues resulting from Black Summer didn't connect those problems as being caused by the fires. And so there's this cognitive gap in communities. There's also the cognitive gap with the organisations that work with communities and in the wider public of how important law is there. And so there's a really big piece around community legal education and upskilling all of us around these pathways and how they determine recovery. Because we know disasters can be poverty-making machines, trauma, discrimination, fiscal stress, housing precarity, and that whole of life uncertainty that enters. And so early resolution in a really holistic way prevents this descent into marginalisation and also prevents having to face these complex issues by people who are already under enormous stress. So One area that we're seeing that's really important I wanted to raise here today, we're seeing new legal issues, such as the pivotal area where building, land use management, planning, insurance and tenancy laws, they're slamming into the increasing area, but quite invisible forced retreat that's occurring, where people are quietly leaving communities and regions due to inability to resolve their legal problems, or even not knowing that there was a legal resolution to it. So these areas need reform, and they need advocates, and communities need assistance with this advocacy. And Bhiamie, you mentioned a few of them that kind of reminded me of that when I was listening to you. So something to think about, there is that perception of law, but the legal sector has a vocation to empower people. There is help, and having someone with specialist expertise to assist someone with Centrelink forms, with insurance company demands that just keep going on. Insurance companies can't give independent legal advice. That's a really important thing to mention here. And also with tenancy issues where your home can be declared uninhabitable overnight and you're not sure what your rights are or what you can do about that. Fines and court issues as well. So we do live in a law-thick world, and disasters shine a light on how thick that world is. And so we need to give communities the capacity to not get caught and trapped by that web. And so that is what community legal centres are doing. Disaster Legal Help Victoria, all states have some kind of legal assistance that's able to be accessed. And so human rights and the early resolution of these legal issues do determine recovery outcomes to such a massive extent. And everything that's controversial and being grappled with in this space has a legal angle that can either enable or inhibit an equitable recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. So to the panelists, come with me, I'm about to change our plan. To the audience, you are asking questions in the Q&A, which is terrific. I'm going to go to a couple of those questions before I ask each of the speakers to answer a pre-planned question, but I'm looking at all of your questions. Bhiamie, the first and most popular question is for you, and you're going to love this. So people would like to know, could you point the participants in the direction of literature that explores the impact of natural disaster on Indigenous communities? And if there are any, could you point towards some good examples of how to work together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in either preparation, mitigation, response, recovery, resilience building? Do you want to point out some few options for people to follow up?
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. Look, look, the literature on this stuff is scant and emerging. There are some good papers and things out there. So in terms of looking for positive examples, I write about a couple of them in my paper, exploring the impacts of the 2019-20 bushfires on Indigenous communities. Yeah, it's called Aboriginal Communities on the Front Lines and Fault Lines. You can Google that, and that'll bring that up. It's got some examples in there. Other good examples internationally, there's a wonderful book published in Canada looking at First Nations wildfire evacuations. That's a really great practical resource guide, although it's from First Nations communities in Canada. It's a really accessible and got some really great tips and hints and things, and a lot of those and the principles that they talk about in that book are directly applicable over to here. Yeah, so, but look, if you just kind of Google or Google Scholar, Indigenous peoples, disaster resilience, emergency management, yeah, have a look and see what interests you and follow those interests. And yeah, I'd encourage you also to look at the recent publication from ERV, Emergency Recovery Victoria, and their Aboriginal Culture and Healing Unit. That's got some wonderful information in there too.
Thanks, Bhiamie. I would like to ask Joanna just a really quick question. Can you please answer a question from a couple of people? Is the data you're talking about in your study New South Wales only, or was that a national study?
It is just New South Wales data. So yeah, we're the New South Wales Council for Social Service, and that was very much our focus, trying to get that New South Wales government to respond the way we wanted them to.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to try and fit in 2 more questions before I ask each of you for a short answer to our planned question. So another question for you, Bhiamie. You know what I'm about to say, but the question reads, Indigenous communities often maintain a deep interconnection with the environment, and when disasters strike, both the community and the environment are impacted. Have there been any studies or assessments that you know of that explore this emotional and psychological toll, the sense of mourning and loss experienced by the communities due to the environmental damage? I know that there was a lot of conversation about this after the Black Summer fires, and how this emotional impact affects their overall well-being. Do you have any awareness of studies of that?
No specific studies of that nature exist that I'm aware of, Margaret. It's a real gap in our knowledge and understanding. There are wonderful resources looking at Indigenous traditions of healing and therapeutic interventions. So yeah, if you look up Indigenous trauma and healing literature, there's some great resources there. And although a lot of those resources have been developed specifically to respond to the experiences of Indigenous community members who were taken away as part of stolen generations, but there's a lot of applicability in that literature, and central in that literature, which is quite well developed, is the central place of country, of being on the land, of seeking healing from the land. Yeah, so it's kind of the land and country and connection with country is, ubiquitous through all of the Indigenous healing literature. We know the land is central and plays a central role in promoting healing and opportunities for, recovery. The bridge hasn't been crossed between specifically looking at the impacts of disasters on Indigenous people's connection with country. We know it's disrupted, but it'd be a wonderful opportunity for a paper as well, or a research project.
Yes, I think a few ideas are coming up in this discussion now that are a very good shining light on an area of research we need to do more in. I'm going to bear with me, Andrew, your question. I'm going to slightly amend it because I think it's a broader question. So there's a question here, and I'd be interested in anybody on the panel, any of your views briefly about how to answer this question. Andrew talks about a particular project on the north coast of New South Wales where some of the least prepared rural land managers don't engage with governments. What they do is they engage with their personal contacts and networks. And his question is, how can government agencies more effectively get the message across to that audience? I'd like to broaden that to the sorts of groups you're each describing. Do you have a key message for governments and agencies about how to more effectively communicate with any of the people that we have been discussing today in this seminar? And I'll just basically throw it open. Would anybody like to have a go at answering that question?
I will jump in really quickly there, Margaret, to just say, our research, our own experience in the Northern Rivers, my Churchill Fellowship really clearly speaks to that top-down, one-size-fits-all approach just not working, not cutting it, and that government needs to use intermediaries. So from my perspective, it is those frontline social service organisations, whether it's Aboriginal community controlled, community legal centres, neighbourhood centres, those that are very locally based, embedded in their communities, have the trusted relationships, know who's who and what's what, and are able to deliver messages, to work with the more disadvantaged and vulnerable communities to prepare and to be ready, and they're the go-to organisations once disaster hits, and they're there for the long haul. They're there for the recovery. It has to be a partnership approach. It absolutely has to involve our emergency managers and the emergency response system working in tandem with recognising the role of these frontline organisations, resourcing them and embedding them in the system.
What she said.
I can see that we're nodding. I actually would like to use that answer, Joanna, as a bit of a segue. I would like the unfairness of it is, in one sentence or less, I would like to hear from each person. And Joanna, you may have just answered this. If you could pick one thing that would change, that would shift the system and shift this experience that you've all described, where disasters disproportionately impact and cause distress and greater divide for particular groups in our society, what has to change? Joanna, do you want to quickly add to anything, or are you happy to stand that you've just answered that question?
Look, I think addressing the fundamental causes of widening inequality, and we do have widening inequality, the data is really clear that gap is increasing, addressing that, but I think also recognising that the social service system at the moment, it is stretched to the absolute limit. It doesn't have a formally recognised role in disaster management. It is a predominantly female workforce, low paid, poor conditions. It needs better recognition and visibility. It needs to be adequately resourced during the good times, let alone when disaster strikes.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joanna. Loriana, do you want to add anything? What would your thing be if you could change one thing?
Look, this is extraordinarily boring, but important. Our data right now is gender and culturally blind, particularly in EM. And so we really need to disaggregate that data. That's a big thing. It's a way that we can demonstrate the case, and we can understand the true effect of what we're doing and what has been done, and the effect of disasters. So boring but important, but disaggregate our data.
Thank you, Loriana. And Bronwyn, what's your pressing thing that needs to change?
So I think that good laws emerge from healthy cultures. So something that I would impress and seen in the work that we do is that includes having really healthy, opening, collaborative organisational cultures across the whole sector, and with that is really, really important, and really fostering that internally and with each other.
Thanks, Bronwyn. And Bhiamie, in case you can't tell, I've intentionally given you the first word and now the last word. What's your thing?
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Look, one of the things that I always advocate for is really uncovering and arresting mindsets that kind of feed the problem in our way of understanding disasters and land management more generally. And just coming back to the concept of country and how Indigenous peoples acknowledge and engage with country is, country is kind of everything and everything exists within it. And if you look at the priorities for responding to disasters, it's people, it's property, it's the environment. But, people and property exist within the environment. So it makes no sense from an Indigenous perspective why environment would be kind of treated or prioritised last when it always comes first. And so I think just arresting our mindsets and just really kind of, appreciating the role of country and that we all exist in country, and that we need to really see country as this living entity capable of supporting life, but capable of, wreaking harm and distress among people if it's not treated with due respect. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Bhiamie. And dare I add, humility to understand that unless we work together to do something differently, and unless we listen to one another, we aren't going to change anything. Extremely sadly, that is all we have time for. I would like to, please feel free to visually applaud, audience. I would like to once again thank Bhiamie, Joanna, Loriana and Bronwyn for making the time to speak with us today. On behalf of the team at AIDA, I thank you for coming to mark this year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. I would like to take this opportunity to announce an exciting new initiative As you can see, we've just touched on a number of issues today. We are thrilled to share that we will be launching a brand new webinar series called Resilience Matters. Resilience Matters will be all about exploring the multifaceted world of disaster resilience. And over the coming months, we'll start delving into all sorts of different topics and themes with speakers and others to support good practice and good thinking. Until then, it's been my absolute pleasure to host you and to talk with the panelists today. Stay safe, and until next time, farewell.